Well, I hope you guys have had a good week since last week, where we talked a little bit about Impressionism. I really liked that clip from Doctor Who. I thought that was great. I am grateful that many people appear to be looking over the assignments rather carefully and being really good about that. Almost everybody is. There's a couple of things that I've noticed where people will get excited and submit before they've read all of the um, parameters about the assignment, all the description for turning the stuff in and getting full credit. One person sent um, a couple photos in their submission that were not photos of the actual assignment, and it was nice because as soon as we figured that out, they went ahead and resubmitted with the pictures that they had intended to, which is really good. And if you don't get full credit for something, I do my best to explain why. And notice that a lot of the time it's because uh, everything wasn't submitted that was talked about in the assignment. For example, with the artist list where you're supposed to pick 20 artists and give their names, title of something that they made, and then a brief description of it. I've seen that a lot of people have just forgotten that last step of that is to write a paragraph where you talk about your search engines, your awareness of information bias or research bias, and how long the assignment took you, and then also the name of the artist that you picked and why. And several people have forgotten that paragraph. And then once they see that, they turn around, resubmit it with that paragraph attached, and then everything's taken care of. I've also noticed that in the bibliography, um, a lot of people are turning that in before they have gone through and formatted it correctly according to the MLA standards that we require for that assignment. Um, the on campus, they have a really great writing office that just there to help students. And you can, if you need the link for that, you can ask me. But that is also something that I you can do a really quick search for just Utah Tech campus student writing lab, and they are really good about helping walk through the MLA. And a couple people did everything absolutely perfect and just forgot after each citation to include accessed on and then the date that they looked at it. With different sites on the internet, even if the website is currently no longer working, you can still use these websites to research what the internet looked like on the day that you access things. Excuse me, I'm having an allergy attack apparently. I'm trying not to sneeze all over the screen because that would be totally disgusting. And my dogs are helping me. One is right here making the motions for sneezing. I think it's a sympathetic thing. I've also got all the grades that all the assignments that have been turned into me. I've been graded, and so if you see additional zeros, it just means that those have not been graded yet. If you resubmit something and I don't grade it within a couple days, please email me. Several students have been really good about that. And one thing I'd like to let you know is that if as we draw closer to the finals time and the end of the term, the last day for turning in assignments is the last day of finals, which is, I believe, Wednesday, May or Thursday, May 4th. Um, Something that can really help so that you're not so stressed is go back through, double check all of your quizzes, and you can retake those until you get a perfect score on all of them. That's a relatively simple thing to do. And also go through and make sure that you watch the videos for each of the weeks that we have, each of the modules. That will make the zero disappear and give you points for that as well. Watch them, write down submit three things that you learned, and if it's something that asks for extra credit, do the extra credit thing. It doesn't hurt at all. For Impressionism, I included the extra credit Van Gogh video. And then for this module, I've also included a bit of extra credit that is a modern take on Dadaism, which is what we're going to be talking about. You remember the last module, we talked about the difference between art periods and art movements. Impressionism is an art movement rather than an art period. There are three primary categories of difference. One is length of time. In general, art periods are going to be significantly longer than art movements. An art period may be at least a generation, up to thousands of years. Generally, they're going to be falling within a period of a century, 100, 200, 300 years. Like the Renaissance is an art period, and that happened over the course of maybe 350 years or longer. Some people, and it varies with who you talk to, but it's a significant length of time. An art movement may be as long as 50 years. People may touch on it later on in time, 100 years later. But for the most part, but that doesn't mean that the art movement lasted 100 years. Somebody is revisiting it. An art movement in itself may last 5, 10, 20 years at the most, maybe. And some of them happen and then are over relatively quickly. And then after that, people will touch on them here and there, but it's not a sustained production like an art period is. So time is one factor that separates them. Second factor is location of the people that are involved. An art period is generally bound by a government or a geographical area. And this could be, for example, for the Renaissance, the art period of the Renaissance, it was pretty much bound by the geographical area of Europe for the most part. Now, we can also look at Byzantine Christian art from that period. That is going to be bound by areas east of the Mediterranean into Turkey, so south and east. But generally, it's going to be a large, a pretty significant area. Mayan art period is going to be around the Yucatan in Mesoamerica. Egyptian art period is going to be in Egypt. An art movement, however, rather than being a function of the culture within which the artists reside, an art movement is individual artists responding to ideas. And so the geographical bounding is going to be quite different. It's going to be wherever those artists are. For example, artists that were involved in Cubism were from several different countries. They met, a couple of them met in France. Some of them were from Spain. Some were from Italy. But it was art, rather than artists finding themselves in a specific country or place, it was more artists meeting together because similar ideas were addressed. And it may very well be that an art movement involves artists on different sides of the world, especially today. And then the third consideration is the focus of the art. For an art period, it's generally going to be responding to or directed by the culture within which the artist lives. For example, art during the Egyptian period or the dynastic Egyptian period is going to be art that is directed by, or motivated rather, by what is important to the culture as a whole. A lot of it is going to be religious based or religious themed or in religious areas for that particular art period. If we look at an art movement, motivation for the art is response to an idea or reaction to an idea or reaction to what other people have done when they responded to an idea. And this is something that I mentioned just a minute ago. We talk about the second separation is uh, geographical location. In the case of the art period, and for an art movement, it's just artists that share a common goal. So they don't have to be bound by a geographical location. And then that common goal in an art movement is expressed by the reaction to ideas. And in an art period, it's not really a common goal, it's a common environment. Um, so go over those again. Period, an art period is defined by a significant length of time, 50 years to thousands of years. An art movement takes place over a much shorter period of time. It could be a couple years, it could be a couple decades. That's one difference. The second difference is an art period is going to be defined by a large geographical location, like a country or a part of the world. And an art movement is the artists involved are going to be linked not because of geographical location, but because they share motivation and ideas. And the third link is that the artists are in an art period are responding to the expectations of the culture at large. And in an art movement, the artists are responding and expressing those specific ideas that bound them together. So those are the three big differences. We talked last week a little bit about you mentioned the gallery system. We mentioned shifting economics, going from the guild system to individual artists producing their own stuff. We talked about how uh, Impressionism focused on artists really trying to express themselves and paint subjects that they were interested in. That the art movement of the Impressionists or Impressionism, we could probably say goes between 1850 and 1910 or so, maybe around there. So it lapped maybe 50, 60 years, but it responded to things like photography and changing technology and just the physical materials that artists had to work with. Now, this one thing that's kind of exciting to me is that during that period, people were really trying to think, well, what is art? And I think I think we can define art. Sorry, my computer's a little bit shaky. We can make definitions for art, and but a lot of the times when we come to art, maybe the definitions that we come up with aren't going to fit for everything. Maybe something that is fits the definition, somebody's definition for art, and when another artist does something or another thing happens, what they produce doesn't feel like it is art anymore, even though it follows the rules. And sometimes art can be produced that we really respond to emotionally, but it doesn't fit the rules. So one, maybe art, something's produced that doesn't feel like art, even though it does fit the rules. And in other cases, art is produced that we recognize as art that doesn't fit the rules. And so, what is it? What are the things that drive expectations? Does art have to be in a gallery setting? Does it have to be in a museum? Does it have to be on a pedestal or hanging on a wall? Does art have to be made by somebody who titles themselves as an artist? Does it have to tell a story, give a narrative? Does it have to look or feel important somehow? Does it does it have to portray something significant or somebody significant? And you can see some of those questions are being tackled by the Impressionists. Mary Cassatt, we talked about, would paint scenes of motherhood rather than kings and queens of Europe. Van Gogh really liked painting just landscapes and scenes from the area that he lived in. And he loved that. And sometimes he would focus just on simple plants that he saw. And we see that a lot in other impressionists, focusing on things that are very different. There's a series of paintings of the Notre Dame where the focus of the painting is not Notre Dame itself, but it's rather how light is reflected at each moment of the day through. And Notre Dame happens to be a convenient structure to kind of use to record the light coming off of something. So subject matter is being played with differently. But there's some other things to think about too. Um, as we're coming into closer to the modern technological age, people are shifting quite a bit. We talked about how much trains changed things. Now we're getting to an area where we're moving towards World War One, which is horrifying. It's the first time that the it feels like the entire world is involved in a conflict. Uh, we go rapidly after World War One. We go rapidly into an era of economic expansion that lasts for 10, 15 years, and then that collapses because it for whatever reason it wasn't entirely sustainable. Then we get the Great Depression, and then towards the end of that, we get a reemergence of some countries exploring and reclaiming their own identities, and also unfortunately we get people rising into power who set the stage for a second world war. So there's a lot of historical things that are going on, and in all this, people are trying to find definitions that help them uh, connect with the people around them, help them to find their own importance in the environment within, their social structure, the culture that they live within, and these ideas of art seem to be important because human beings are one of the few animals that can produce art. There are some others that seem to be able to, but I think a big difference is that humans can talk about the work they produce as well. But 1910, the gallery system that we mentioned about with the Impressionists, is really having a stranglehold on. For some artists, it feels like they feel this has a stranglehold on their creativity. Somebody's telling them exactly what to do. They're basically ordering them to produce paintings. And I think, well, we got away from that kind of patronage system generations ago. We shouldn't be going back into it. And so you get a group of people that come together and they start producing things to explore the validity of calling something art when all the primary purpose for it is to witness to the fact that somebody created it, and that's it. I mean, there's no sense, there's no narrative, and the name for this movement is called Dadaism or Dada. And the reason why that word was picked is it's one of the first sounds that a baby seems to have control over, that they don't really generate or connect a meaning to until they can. In many cultures, that is one of the first words for father. But the word itself makes absolutely no sense. It's complete nonsense. And so a group of about a half dozen, 10 artists got together, and I believe it was in Zurich, 1910, and they started doing this to kind of expose the pretension that art has to be important somehow. It can't, and they wanted to show that art could be valid just as an object that witnessed to the fact that humans can build or humans can create. So you get a lot of really weird stuff that just doesn't make sense because the point was to make stuff that did not make sense, which seems counterintuitive to me. But when we look at this, it generates ideas that we still use today. And but a lot of us will. I think when we look at this, a lot of us can. There's many things that we can agree on that may be very difficult to see the art in whatever it is. There are other Dadaist plays, there was Dadaist music, there was Dadaist performances that are really hard to define, dances. People did Dadaist paintings, costumes, just all sorts of stuff that just was very weird, but it was designed specifically to get people to think about what is the intrinsic value, or is there an intrinsic value just to the fact that art can exist. There was one woman named Hannah Hoch who did collages. And this is the first time that we really see an artist claiming that a collage is an original work. A collage is where you've already made several of these. You cut out pictures that other people have designed, formatted, and printed, and then you put them together in new configurations. Uh, Another word for this is visual appropriation. The reason why this was not considered to be art at the time was because people still felt that an artist needed to be responsible for every level of creation of the object that they're promoting as a piece of art. Which I think, if we really think about that for very long, it seems kind of silly because all of you have worked with paints, all of you have worked with pencils and pens and paper, but very few of you have actually made your own paper, pencils, pens, and paints. It's very rare that we make our own brushes even. We can, if you're interested, I can show you how to do some of that on your own. But we're already creating stuff with objects that other people have built for us. With the invention, Hannah's invention of the collage, she's really saying, she's presenting ideas like, let me take something that somebody else spent the time to create, put it into a new setting, and put it in a setting with new relations with other images, and see what new things we can create. I think that this is nowadays we do this all the time. You guys have already made several collages, but this was really earth-shattering at the time. She was a feminist artist. She uh, dealt with narratives and ideas about uh, her role as a woman in society and about femininity in general. And some of her work is extraordinary. But looking at it from today and being able to see that is quite different. I can imagine how shocked people like my grandpa may have been when he saw this and thought, "Wow, that's not art. She didn't paint it." Well, it doesn't matter. She still made it, and that's the important part. There was poetry. There was poetry that was being written and read by these guys, um, and they would meet as groups. Uh, the Dadaist artists would. They would discuss, just like what we're talking about right now, what is art? What does it mean to be a creator? What does it mean to be a human being? And they would publish some of their findings, as well as some of their ideas and some of the examples of the work that they did in magazines, that they would call this the exquisite corpse, which it's a title designed specifically to put people on edge, but we can look at the context and see that they're not talking about death. They are talking about the the physical remnants or the physical evidence of the process of creation. So they were just making to make, in one sense, and they were creating things trying to be devoid of direct narrative and direct meaning, specifically so that people could look at the objects and the things and the events for what they were, which is basically examples of human creativity. Uh, One of the poets, one of the ways that they would do poetry is basically get random words and put the words together randomly, and then express that as a poem or deliver that as a poem. And that's actually going to be one of your studio exercises, something similar to that. You're actually going to be writing a sentence like that, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, this Dadaism actually, I said 1910, it actually started around 1915, but that's not quite. I think that was when the first magazine, Exquisite Corpse, was published, but these artists have been thinking about it for quite a while. And another movement that happened about this same time started, first evidence of it appeared in 1910, and this is the movement called Cubism. Braque and Picasso were buddies and roommates. They were the two guys that started are credited with starting Cubism, and they had come across some petroglyphs, some rock painting art from Zimbabwe that actually that totally blew them away. We think a little bit about, I don't know if you've ever seen blueprints or diagrams or plans for something. where they'll show a top view, maybe a bottom view, maybe a side view, an interior view, different views of the same object. And these are designed to give people a better understanding and better spatial awareness of what the object is actually going to look like in real life once it gets made, or how it looked to whoever was observing it and recording it. One of the things that the Cubists did was take this idea of the multiple views and would put portions of these multiple views onto the same area and onto the same figure. And this is one of the reasons why maybe a human being in a Cubist painting, you'll see a profile of them with the very obvious eyes and nose. And then instead of the eye being to the side, maybe as the other half of the portrait, the eye will be facing forward. And it's not because they don't know how to do a painting. They did know. Most of the Cubists, if not all of them, were classically trained. They knew how to paint figures photorealistically, but they were doing this specifically to approach that idea of, rather than just painting at one static moment and one static view, let's show a person actually moving around the subject. So they're painting it as if the viewer saw several aspects of the subject all at the same time. Uh, Different facets of the subject as they perhaps move through time, even different moments of it. Some of the areas would feel to be very simplified because the artist is trying to show almost almost snapshots or sketches of different portions as seen from different parts or different areas or different moments of time. This, I don't know, I kind of get excited about this kind of stuff. It's called Cubism because uh, there were a lot of angular lines used, and I think it's a very good chance that was in relation to the idea of blueprints or moving an object around in a drawing. And you'll see that in the portion on Cubism. You'll see two different views of a brick kiln or brick furnace, and you can that gives you an idea of what the Cubist was showing. This influenced most other aspects of art from that point forward. Any art that was produced by anybody that had contact with Europe um, showed aspects of the influence of Cubism from about 1920 onward. And it's astounding how much people resonated with it, whether or not you're like my grandpa who felt that it was a waste of time. Doesn't really matter because the reality is uh, people responded to the expression of the idea that we can have multiple viewpoints at the same time and hold multiple viewpoints at the same time. I came across a TED Talk recently about a person who invented the term intersectionality, where she's a sociologist and she talks about we can't define ourselves just as uh, one gender and one origin and one perspective, because all of us are made up of several things. Like typical man also has estrogen that is necessary to be healthy. Uh, Man may not fit to stereotypical mold because even though he may have facial hair, he still may be the nurturer for his children. But then also, instead of being defined as a Christian or a Muslim only, that individual could be somebody who expresses their spirituality in multiple different ways or perspectives. Instead of just being um, a person who is one religion, that gentleman or that individual may also have a specific job that they're attached to that forms part of their identity. And not just that, but maybe they also have side hustles or they do gig work as well. And in addition to that, maybe they have hobbies. But all these kinds of things, we can say, um, for example, I can say I'm a man, I'm a Christian, I teach, but I also have several daughters. I grew up in a household of women. I raised my daughters and changed their diapers and fed them and did all that kind of stuff. Uh, in addition to teaching, I also design and build custom artwork for people, as well as do web design and development. My hobbies include reading an awful lot. And in addition to being a Christian, I'm also a pluralist minister or chaplain. I work with several people of several different faiths, and I find a lot of similarities. So very rapidly, if each of us look at ourselves, we can see that we are made up of several different kinds of things. None of us have a very simple, uh, flat definition of who we are. And I think that this, although that term was defined relatively recently, this is something that people are realizing, and the early 1900s, that human beings are made up of a lot of different stuff. That leads us into World War One, and this is when people are starting to realize that everybody's human. You don't have the inhuman enemy, and you're the only one that God listens to when you pray. Uh, there's going to be multiple perspectives, and uh, the idea is that people are just complex, and that really shows up in Cubism. You have a lot of that kind of faceted nature being illustrated in a painting. What is interesting to me as well is at this time that this is when uh, demographic studies for advertising agencies really started uh, gaining importance, where they would find they could target ads for specific groups of population. And a lot of the times ads, they could tell right away that ads would be a lot more effective when they targeted multiple aspects of those demographics within a population. Some of the other, or another one of the big names in Cubism is Cezanne. And we talked about Nude Descending a Staircase, it's a painting of that. And I just think it's a fascinating perspective. Whether or not you like Cubism or Dadaism, that doesn't matter as much as the fact that you're aware of it and you can appreciate what the artists were thinking or trying to express as they were doing it. The third art movement that we're going to be talking about is Surrealism. Now, Surrealism, it followed directly on the heels of Dadaism. And what we're still dealing with that time period between 1910, 1920, going into 1930s. Um, Surrealism is really addressing the idea of what's the point? What's the narrative that people are trying to express in art? In Renaissance art, the narrative was pretty straightforward. This is a biblical story, or this is a historical event, or the narrative is this is a wealthy person or a ruler, and the painting is designed specifically with symbolism to help us appreciate how important that person is. Um, and this is also, if we look in psychology, this is also when people like Freud and Carl Jung are really working hard at finding out how they can help people with mental illness or neuropathologies. And it's fascinating to me because, particularly in European culture, when somebody was crazy, if they had suffered from depression or things like that, people had no idea how to deal with it at all. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, people are starting to really invest time and effort in finding out how the human mind works. And so surrealism dealt with a lot of these issues of meaning and narrative, storytelling, trying to show an access to the subconscious mind. But in surrealism, it was a little bit less direct. So what I'm saying, yes, symbols are used. You see them all through surrealism, but the meanings of the symbols are not as important as the fact that you are aware of them being symbols. So the story behind the symbols almost disappears, or it becomes less important than the fact that the artist is using a symbol. the symbols placed together, they were designed specifically not to necessarily make a lot of sense. It's designed more to make you think of dream landscape. I think Salvador Dali is an excellent example of a surrealist where he would build these landscapes that when you look at them and you allow yourself to think back, maybe you've had dreams that remind you of these landscapes as opposed to being able to identify them as a physical place in the world. And one thing that I've learned is looking at surrealist art is that there's an underlying uh, nod at humor a little bit too. And I think a lot of that is, I'm not taking slapstick humor. Sometimes, many times, the humor is a little bit dark, but you get the idea that the artist is having a little bit of fun as they're doing this. They're enjoying, sometimes they're enjoying their work, or many times they are. And so that's some of the things that we need to look at with surrealism. The narrative or story being told is um, incomprehensible much of the time, and that's completely unimportant. The characters, the symbols that are being used, do not necessarily have to have any relation to each other. They just We just have to be aware of the fact that they are symbols, and that's pretty much it. Whether or not it has any meaning that we can bring out is that's a side effect. And then the relation between the things is designed to help us to feel more like it's a landscape within our mind, in our particularly in our subconscious mind. Not because they're trying to paint a dream or share a dream or help you to develop a dream. What they're doing is access, trying to help us to access a part of our mind where, like during dreams, we dismiss the fact that things don't make sense and we just exist within it because we're dealing with a subconscious mind. So, as in Dadaism, they were trying to remove meaning from something that was made because they felt that they wanted people to know that it had importance just because of the fact that it had been made. In Surrealism, symbols and the relationship between things in a painting or among things in a painting, it's more important to realize that they are symbols as opposed to that they have any specific meaning as symbols. And then, like I said, there's this little bit of humor going on. And you can see that in many things. Uh, Images are unexpected and surprise you a little bit. I've seen many of this very famous surrealist paintings, being able to see them in uh, museums in the countries where they were painted. It's kind of fun to see little kids look at these things, and at first they look a little worried, and then they smile. So maybe they're picking up on the humor, or maybe they're smiling because they have gas. Who knows? But these three different movements, I think the biggest thing that they share in common is, like I said, through somebody like my grandpa, his eyes, um, they they don't seem to make sense to a lot of people, and they don't seem to qualify as functioning as art. And that's totally fine. Again, you don't have to like it, but I think it's a really good practice to appreciate it. If you get super confused, use your tools of critical thinking. See if you can describe it to yourself. See if you can figure out how the artist made the shapes or designs. See if there is some underlying meaning to the specific symbols and how they place them. Whether or not there is, maybe there is for you. And then see if it's well constructed and decide whether or not it's successful for what it is. I think this is a really good time to remember that it's very difficult for us to judge something appropriately when we are outside of the context of whatever that object or thing exists, was made in. And I think it does help to remember that this was pretty daring stuff for these people. And there were a couple paintings that were done during this period that became a threat to the life of the painter. One famous one is Guernica, which is a Cubist work done in grayscale by Pablo Picasso. And his life was threatened many times because of that. And the painting is still, I believe, guarded by security officers with machine guns because it is a dangerous piece of art. Now, as we move on, um, think about those things, and it would be really a good idea to see if you could even do some look up some video stuff. There's 2 or 3 or 4 minute videos about those each of those movements on YouTube, and see if you can find out anything with that. Now, with the first of the 2 assignments associated with this is written reflection, and on that, I want you to, using your tools of critical thinking, reflect on what you've seen and what you are learning about Dada, Cubism, and Surrealism. And then the thing that's really interesting is look around and see where that shows up today. You can see all over the social media, there is the influence of Dadaism and Cubism and Surrealism. I mean, it's everywhere. Behind me in this video is a surrealist landscape. It's a science fiction fantasy landscape, but without the movement of surrealism, artists wouldn't have had the permission to paint something like this that is physically, most likely physically impossible. So there's something to really think about there with things like contemporary movies, science fiction action movies, contemporary advertising. How are images put together in contemporary advertising? People who will paint and draw images that basically relate to dreams that they've had, performances. One good example of the influence of Dadaism in contemporary culture is when people do sound sampling. They're appropriating sounds from other artists, most of the time from other artists and from other sources, taking snips of them, taking them out of context, and then lacing them together in a new construct that develops a completely new narrative and a new context. So sound sampling like that is a good example. One that may not seem something that most people think about is the Foley artists working for movies do this kind of thing all the time. When you watch a movie with something that's like in surround sound or something like that, what is fascinating to me is a lot of the times the actual sounds on set when they're filming are really not very clear. And for movies, especially adventure movies and fantasy movies and science fiction type stuff, a lot of the times the Foley artists are the ones that work specifically with the sound of a movie. They have to regenerate the sounds that you expect when you see the image that should have taken place on the set, but they also have to generate completely new sounds. Think about dinosaurs roaring. There's not an awful lot of people alive today who actually listen to a real dinosaur roaring, and or what would a laser shotgun sound like? What does a dragon sound like? Those kinds of sounds. Or how can you make stepping on a grape loud enough that you can hear it in a movie? Because most of the time, if you're in a real life setting, you're not going to really hear stuff like that. What would it sound like? How do we expect it? I don't know how many times you've heard a real gunshot happen in an urban setting. It doesn't sound at all like it does in most movies. And so they have to generate or create new sounds from samples that they've made that is a little bit surreal because it doesn't connect, it doesn't match reality quite, but it does match what our expectations as an entertained audience, well, we've developed as expectations to what that sound should be. And so those are all contemporary examples of, for example, Dadaism and Surrealism. Cubism, we can see that in. I think it's absolutely fascinating to see some of these magazine ads where people play on these famous paintings that were so daring and shocking at the time they were originated, and they use it in their paintings. Now, there's an ongoing critical race theory conversation about cultural appropriation. Is it okay to borrow from other people's cultures and things like that? My short answer to that is, in a global environment, we live in a global community. Uh, it's going to be completely fine to appropriate things that we can use to make our life and our communication better. Uh, my only mitigating factor would be uh, being aware of where we appropriate from and showing respect, having respect for the original sources and the original context. But that conversation about appropriation comes as a result of the reverberations, the vibrations that these three art movements have generated: Cubism, Surrealism, and Dadaism. So think about all that as you go into writing the reflection. And like I said, even it might be interesting to do your own research. If you like, or if you really strongly dislike some of the artwork that you see as you're looking at this stuff, show it to your roommates or the people that you know, and see if you can find somebody who has a reaction completely different than you, and ask them to talk about that and maybe put that in your reflection too. And then for the studio, what I want you to do is, these are some exercises that are very similar to the kinds of things that people in these get-togethers, particularly the Dadaist get-togethers, would do. And the assignment is called Exquisite Corpse Exercises. I took some pictures of stuff that I had done and posted it in there too, so you can get a good idea of what's going on. The first one is creating surrealist sentences or Dadaist sentences. You're going to have 5 piles or 5 cups or 5 bowls. You're going to write down, um, for example, you're going to get a whole bunch of slips of paper, and then you're going to write down, for the first pile, 10 words that are the or an, and put those in that pile. Second pile, you're going to write down 10 different words that can modify a noun. And these are adjectives. So, like, these are words that are descriptive words, either of appearance or time. And you're going to put those down. 10 different words of that. In the third pile, you'll write down 10 different things. These are nouns that you put in that third pile. In the fourth pile, you are going to write down, I'm sorry, the second pile, you're going to write down things that describe something. And I'm sorry, time is not one of those. But these are words like colors. These are words like textures, words like relatively length, short, tall, uh, wide, narrow, words like that. And the third pile, it's going to be the nouns. And these can be pretty much anything, like a soccer ball, zebra, car, cloud, moon, whatever. In the fourth pile, you're going to write down, these are words that help to modify a verb, like how was something done? When was something done? Was it done quickly, smoothly, slowly, darkly, uh, humor, with humor, or humorlessly? Did it happen earlier today, in the morning, at night, or when? Those kinds of things, and that would be in your fourth pile. In the fifth pile, you write down 10 different words that are verbs, like drink, um, play, curse, sing, listen, words like that. So you have 5 different piles. Each of them have 10 slips of paper in them. And on each of these 10 slips of paper, there's a different word that fits specifically within that pile. Then after you do that, you're going to mix up the paper in each of the piles, and you're going to draw 2 words from each of the 5 piles and put that into a new pile. And you're going to slide that to the side, pick out the next 2 words from each of the 5 piles, put that together, set that to the side. Don't mix those 2 up, and do that until you don't have any more slips of paper. Then you're going to take each of those 5 piles, and each of these 5 piles have 2 words like the or an, 2 words that describe a noun, like green or hollow, 2 words that are nouns, two words that describe how you perform a function, and two words that are the function or the verb. And you're going to look at each of these five piles, and you're going to create a nonsense sentence from the words in that pile. And you'll write that down as a note somewhere. And what you're gonna have to do is each of these five sentences that should not make any sense at all, out of words that you wrote but are completely randomized, you're going to write those five sentences on five separate pieces of paper. So that's the first exercise. The second exercise is you're going to take 5 sheets of printer paper. So the paper needs to be identical. And you're going to draw one of those 5 sentences completely at random and use that to draw a picture. And it can inspire. I use the word inspire because I don't want you illustrating that sentence. If it's a nonsense sentence, that's going to be very difficult to illustrate it. It won't make any sense. But just do a sketch or a drawing. Spend about 15 minutes on it that is inspired by what you read in that one sentence. So that is, you're going to do that for all 5 of the sentences. So now you have 5 nonsense sentences and 5 really weird drawings. Now you're going to turn all those upside down. You're going to put on one side, you're going to have the 5 drawings and you're going to mix those up. The other side, you're going to have the 5 sentences and you're going to mix those up. And without turning anything over, you're going to pick one drawing and one sentence, put it together, set it aside. One drawing, one sentence, put it together and set it aside. So you've randomized it again. Then, after you do that, you're going to turn everything over, and one at a time, you'll take the drawing with the brand new nonsense sentence and write that sentence at the bottom of the drawing, and that's going to be the title. This is going to be very weird. Sometimes the things will fit together really, really well, but 99 times out of 100, it'll make absolutely no sense whatsoever, and that is perfectly fine. That's what you're supposed to be doing. And then for the fourth exercise, I don't know if you've ever done one of this game where you take paper, you fold it into thirds, so you only see it 1/3 at a time. And then on each third, you draw like the head of something. Then you go to the next, you switch papers with somebody else. Then on that middle third, you draw the body of something. You fold that over, switch paper with somebody else, and then you draw the bottom. So that whichever area you're drawing at the time, you can't see the other stuff. And in that module, you'll see the example that I did really quickly. In this case, what you're going to do is have 3 sheets of paper, fold them up, and if you want, you can do this with other people too, but I try to do this so that you can do this on your own without having to interact with other people. But you're going to draw on the top third 3 different heads, fold them over, mix them up, and then draw 3 different bodies. That what I would suggest is 3 bodies that don't have anything to do with any of the 3 heads you just drew. So that's why I think that'd be a good idea, because then you don't have to worry about if you accidentally grab the same one and are continuing the same drawing. And if you do the bodies, you turn the paper, fold the paper over, and do the feet or the legs. Same kind of thing. And I give a good example of that. It's dog canary bat is what I've drawn. And to turn this in, what you're going to be doing is looking at these 3 randomized drawings that you've done and those 5 images that don't make a lot of sense, that have as their titles the 5 nonsense sentences that you did. And you're going to put all those in your submission and then write a paragraph of 3 to 5 sentences about how long you worked on this, how the experience made you feel, if it was enlightening or really confusing, or mixture of those, and what similarities do you see between what you did and what you learned about in Dadaism and Surrealism. So that's what those exercises are there for. If you have any questions, go through and read everything, and then let me know after you've read everything. Let me know if you have any more questions, and we can talk about it again next week. But between now and then, I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful week. And again, everything is due on the last day of finals. That's May 4th, I believe, on a Thursday. And again, zeros, you guys can resubmit or turn things in for the first time as and get those zeros taken care of. So take care of yourselves and have a good weekend. And I will see you all next Wednesday. If I can figure out how to turn off my computer and on again. We'll see ya.